This incident would transform the diving industry worldwide. An American couple diving in the stunning Great Barrier Reef of Queensland, Australia, was abandoned in open water by the diving company tasked with their safety. None of the other divers, the captain, or the crew noticed they were missing when the boat departed at the scheduled time, making the hour-and-a-half trip back to shore and leaving the Lonergans in shark-infested waters. They would remain undiscovered for over 48 hours, and when the search commenced, there was no evidence of their presence. Since their vanishing, various theories have circulated: suicide pact, murder, or an elaborate scheme to fake their deaths and start anew. But no one can say with certainty what happened to Eileen and Tom Lonergan. Let's delve into the details. It was a perfect day for diving on January 25, 1998. The married couple, 33-year-old Tom Lonergan and his 28-year-old wife, Eileen, were enjoying a weekend getaway after completing a 2-year teaching contract with the Peace Corps in Fiji. The water was described as crystal clear, with no wind and nearly flawless visibility. That morning, they left their hostel in Cairns, Australia, and took a pre-booked 40-minute bus ride to Port Douglas. They had booked the round-trip shuttle ahead of time, and they were set to return when the dive tour completed around 4:30 p.m. The Australian trip was going to cap off their time in the South Pacific. They were headed back to a new chapter of their lives, going back to a quote-unquote normal life back in Baton Rouge, Louisiana for the first time in years. They seemed to both struggle with what their lives were going to be moving forward. Tom had enrolled in college but didn't have a lot of direction. We know this because they both kept extremely detailed and poetic diaries. The way they wrote was lyrical, expressive, and dramatic. They wrote in hand-bound leather books, and they wrote in a way that left all of their emotions, thoughts, and fears on the page. And they wrote a lot near daily with pages and pages of entries. In Fiji, they had lived in a remote village. For years, they lived without electricity and running water. They taught together, but Eileen struggled with the students. Tom was better at it, but neither shared a passion for teaching, but they did care about their students. They both shared a deep love for the ocean. They were very experienced, incompetent divers, and their love of the sea was something that really bonded the pair together. Diving had been something Eileen had been passionate about before she'd met Tom, and was something that she'd passed on to him. Before we dive in, don't forget to subscribe to our new channel, where we uncover captivating and chilling cold cases that will keep you on the edge of your seat. You won't want to miss the twists and turns we have in store. Okay, let's continue. While diving in Fiji, Eileen wrote to her mother about an extremely emotional experience that they'd had in the water. They'd been approached by a whale so close they'd been able to reach out and touch it. Eileen looked into the whale's eyes and felt a deep connection to the animal. It had been a spiritual experience for both Tom and Eileen, and it left them buzzing. Tom wrote after the experience, quote, "Like a student who has finished an exam, I feel that my life is complete and I'm ready to die. As far as I can tell from here, my life can only get worse. It's peaked. It's all downhill from here until my funeral." They arrived at the harbor at 8:30 a.m. and boarded the tour boat operated by the Outer Edge. They were joined by 26 other guests. Not everyone was diving. Most were snorkeling, but all had been promised a spectacular day on the water. It was absolutely ideal conditions, and the group was incredibly excited to get going. The crew loaded the gear on the boat and put air tanks and other diving gear, accounting for everyone diving that day. Outer Edge had planned on taking the group to 3 different sites, staying at each area for about an hour and a half before heading back to port. It was an all-day package, and there wasn't a second tour booked that day for the boat or the crew. The Lonergans had a lot of their own diving gear, and despite the heat of the day, they opted to dive in full protective gear. And their experience allowed them to maximize their air tanks, allowing them to be in the water just a little bit longer. For the first 2 dives, they've been the last 2 people back on the boat, capitalizing on every second they could be in the water. Their last dive for the day was an area of the reef called Fish City. It had spectacular displays of thousands of fish, and it was going to be the highlight of the tour. There are some reports that the boat that day was running late. It was about 3:30 p.m. when Outer Edge started up the engine to depart the area. So every time a passenger went into the water, they were supposed to log out and then log back in when they were back on the vessel, and another measure of security is conducting a head count. The boat sat for about 15 minutes while the crew checked everyone back onto the boat, put away all the equipment, and passed out refreshments to the passengers and counted everyone up before heading back to Port Douglas. Not one of the crew members had noticed that 2 of their guests for the day hadn't checked back in and their head count was too short. Once back at the port, the guests departed, taking all of their belongings with them. And again, no concerns were raised when 2 pairs of shoes and 2 backpacks were left on the boat. The bus driver also waited nearby. The bus company knew that the Lonergans had gone out without her Edge, so after waiting for about an hour, the driver went up to the crew and asked if they knew where the Lonergans were, as they'd booked a shuttle back to Cairns and he needed to get going. The captain, Jack Nairn, reassured the driver that the Lonergans must have taken another method back to their hostel and to just head out. The driver felt that it had been very strange and called his supervisor, who also spoke to Outer Edge, but both times they were reassured that maybe the Lonergans had made friends with other guests and had gone out with them, just tourists doing tourist things. The bus driver eventually left, and the crew brought the Lonergans' belongings back to their office, and then everyone went home. Well, everyone except Tom and Eileen. The next morning, Outer Edge returned to the same area that they'd been the previous day, and a crew member with the company was out at Fish City with clients and discovered 6 loose diving weights on the seabed with the Outer Edge label on them. However, again, this wasn't marked as odd. There were lots of different diving companies, and some people were careless with the equipment, so it was normal for crew members to tidy up after clients. It wouldn't be until Tuesday evening, 2 full days since the Lonergans had been left at sea, when employees at the Outer Edge office decided to open up the bags left behind from the Sunday excursion. Inside, they found the Lonergans' wallets, travel documents, and cash, things they had been unlikely to forget for 2 days traveling. Panic and realization began to set in for the employees at Outer Edge. Phone records showed staff members making frantic calls trying to find a better outcome than what they assumed might have happened. When they called the Lonergans' hostel, the Walkabout, and spoke to the owner, Barry Waymans, Barry confirmed that they hadn't seen the Lonergans since they took a shuttle out to Port Douglas. The hostel owner had been the one who was furious, and it was he who called the police to report the couple missing. Police were called 52 hours after the Outer Edge had left Fish City and left Tom and Eileen in the water. By the time the police had been called, search conditions were not good. It was too dark and the search couldn't be started until dawn. In addition to law enforcement and local searchers, the Australian Navy had been called in to aid the search. 20 aircrafts were also deployed to search 86 100 nautical square miles. In total, there were water planes, helicopters, boats, divers, and people on foot searching the coastlines near the reefs. All were looking for any sign of the missing American couple. Once the search was underway, there had been maintained hope that Eileen and Tom could have survived for up to 4 days in the water. They had already lost nearly 3 days in the delay, but there was still hope. Unlike many of their companions, Tom and Eileen had gone out that day in full gear despite the warm weather. They had on heavy, long-sleeve wetsuits, hoods, and gloves, which would have been critical and had the potential to really increase their chances of staving off hypothermia. However, dehydration was still a concern, and a deadly predator known to stalk that area, tiger sharks. After 4 days of searching and finding no sign of Tom and Eileen, the search was eventually called off. Law enforcement found several things strange. The first was with Outer Edge, how they left 2 of their passengers out in the water that day. The company was thoroughly investigated by law enforcement. The captain took full responsibility for the mistake, but it had been the whole crew ultimately responsible. The captain stated that the logbooks not being filled out was a negligent mistake and a bad habit picked up over time, where the crew would fill the logbooks out while they were heading back. But for some reason, it had just been missed entirely that day. He said that a head count had been conducted while people were still coming onto the deck from the water, and initially the count had come up short, but a recount had accidentally accounted for a couple who'd been in the water at the start of the count, and then they were accounted again when they came up onto the boat. Other guests who were also diving reported seeing the couple about 15 minutes before they were all supposed to wrap up their dives for the day, so they couldn't have been that far from the boat. Sound carries underwater quite a distance, and the boat had been idling for some time while the crew got everything in order to leave and also handing out drinks to guests. No one can understand how Tom and Eileen had missed the boat even if they were a bit far away initially. Next were the circumstances of Tom and Eileen's disappearance. What also stood out as odd with law enforcement was when they discovered that there had been other vessels anchored at St. Crispin's Reef, the area where Outer Edge had anchored at. Many of the other boats were there long after Outer Edge had left, and no one reported seeing or hearing anyone in distress. One fishing boat had stayed in the area as late as midnight and had remained lit. The waters had been calm and the boat would have been easy to spot. They also heard nothing, and in those conditions, they should have been able to hear someone calling for help in the water, even from quite a distance. Without any sign of the couple, this was when the theory started rolling in about what kind of people the Lonergans were. Their diaries were located amongst their belongings left behind at the hostel, and detectives started to pick apart their lives. The couple had met while attending the University of Louisiana. They got married in Jefferson, Texas on June 24, 1988. The two had always had a very intense and passionate relationship. They were both extremely intelligent people. Tom describes himself as having few great loves in his life, and they were his intellect, his wife, his students, and diving. Tom was known to be kind of harsh and intense, and Eileen was the complete opposite of him and softened him. She was also the adventurous one of the two, and it had been her idea to join the Peace Corps. In Tom's diary, he writes that Eileen had been a gift from God and wrote of his utter devotion to his wife. Eileen wrote of her concerns for their marriage, and not that she didn't love Tom, but that she felt that she was losing her individuality. In their time on the remote islands in isolation, they had become one, but over time, the relationship had become too codependent for Eileen's taste. They both wrote about concerns they had for the future. Tom's diary starts to get a bit macabre. He wrote about life and God and their meanings. They each wrote of these kind of large philosophical discussions that they'd been having. Eileen wrote, quote, "Tom hopes to die a quick and painless death, and he hopes it happens soon. Tom's not suicidal, but he's got a death wish, and that could lead him to what he desires, and I could get caught in that." It had been that passage that led to several speculations that their disappearance hadn't just been a simple accident. Accusations that Tom had wanted to die and had perhaps wanted the two of them to die together and had purposely missed the boat. However, it's important to note that they were really reading between the lines with that conclusion. Their writing style was consistently very dramatic and lyrical. There were also permanent pontoon structures built all around St. Crispin's Reef. The closest one had only been 6 kilometers from where Outer Edge had anchored. The structures are used as docking structures for various tours. It helps to not damage the reefs by using anchors near the delicate ecosystems. Experts speculated that they could have swum to them and hid there overnight and then got onto another boat when the tours started coming back in. There had been reports that at the Agincourt pontoon or Quicksilver pontoon, there had been a large vessel filled with Italian tourists. The head count before departure had been over by 3 guests, but it was chalked up to a miscount. However, Tom and Eileen's disappearance drew media attention. The vessel came forward with the report in case it turned out to be relevant. There were sightings of the couple all over Australia, which again drew law enforcement's attention to theories that the couple had staged their deaths to start a new life. What hadn't helped was that Tom and Eileen had been adamant that they didn't want to dive with others or with a dive master, and they wanted to go off on their own that day, which at the time hadn't drawn any concerns given that they were very experienced divers. But after the disappearance had led to more questions on why they wanted to be by themselves. 3 months went by, and Eileen's family went to Australia to see where Eileen and Tom had disappeared. They even dived the waters in the area with the help of Australian authorities escorting them. They eventually held a funeral for the couple and, after seeing the area for themselves, came to terms with the fact that the couple were no longer with them. 6 months after their disappearance, a team still looking for any signs of the Lonergans was combing a remote beach in Port Douglas when they saw something sticking out of the sand. The first item found was a woman's wetsuit. It was the same style that Eileen had been wearing the day that they had been last seen. It was the same size. It had a little damage on the bottom and the armpit area, but it had likely come from rubbing against coral in the currents before washing ashore. Otherwise, the suit was in pretty pristine condition. Once one item was found, a larger team was deployed to the area, and soon other items tied to the Lonergans were discovered. Over a 100 kilometers or 75 miles from Fish City, they found 2 inflatable dive jackets, and these had Tom and Eileen's names written on the inside. so there was no speculation of who they belonged to. The next items found were dive tanks and one fin. Like the wetsuit, none of the items appeared to be damaged. They had searched for any sign of shark attack, but other than some sun damage and barnacle growth, the items were in incredible condition. The clasps on the dive jackets also seemed to have been manually released rather than slipped off. It appeared that they had removed the gear themselves. They searched the area hoping to recover bodies, but they weren't found. Then, a diver's slate was found by fishermen 90 miles from where Eileen and Tom had been diving around 6 months after their disappearance. The slate had been badly exposed to the elements, but once the fishermen made it out, they knew exactly who the slate had belonged to. It said, Monday, January 26, 1988, 8 a.m. To anyone who can help us, we have been abandoned here on Agincourt Reef by the MV Outer Edge. January 25, 1998, 3 p.m. Please help us or we will die. Help, Tom and Eileen Lonergan. 1502, Lenmore. The slate went through an extensive authentication verification. Based on the algae growth and the handwriting, experts believe that the slate was Tom Lonergan's, and he did write that note. According to the slate, it appeared that the Lonergans had made it at least until the following morning, only missing the next round of tourist boats by hours. But the slate still didn't explain why other vessels nearby hadn't seen or heard any sign of them that first night. Despite finding all of the belongings of Eileen and Tom, it still ultimately only caused more questions than answers. Had delirium caused them to take off their equipment? Without the buoyancy vests, it would have made it impossible for them to tread water that long. And why did Eileen take off her wetsuit? Outer Edge and the owner, Jack Nairn, were charged with unlawful killing. At trial, Nairn was found not guilty, but Outer Edge was fined severely after pleading guilty. The company soon went out of business, and one report has said that none of the crew connected to the Lonergan trip worked in the diving industry anymore. Nairn deeply apologized to Eileen's family, and they gave him a hug after the trial and said that they forgave him. 9 months after their disappearance, Tom and Eileen were declared deceased by the Australian coroner's inquest. Their cause of death was listed as drowning or shark attack. One tiger shark expert from Port Douglas stated, quote, "My personal feeling is that they were taken by a tiger shark in the first 24 to 48 hours. Dead or alive, you wouldn't last too long out there." Because of the case, Australia implemented new regulations for the diving industry, including mandatory head counts conducted by captains and dive masters, more thorough regulations regarding the logbooks, more training for staff, and mandatory lookouts on board every tour boat, as well as harsher regulations and fines for negligence and non-compliance. Though there's no evidence that directly points to Eileen and Tom having made it out of the water, it wouldn't have been an impossible feat. Another former Baton Rouge resident, Milton Windsor Harris, had been on the run for 16 years, escaping prison for corporate embezzlement, and fakes his death by jumping off of a ferry in New Zealand. He was discovered on the other side of the planet in Northern Ireland with his wife and 3 children. We may never know what happened to Eileen and Tom Lonergan, and without the discovery of their bodies, there will be no certainty in their disappearance, ultimately chalked up to an avoidable tragedy. In 1994, Tanya Fraser lived in the Mount Baker neighborhood of southeast Seattle with her mother and sister. The 14-year-old tomboy was sweet and generous, bringing joy to those around her despite her somewhat shy nature. She served as an altar server at St. Clement's Episcopal Church and spent July 17th at a church picnic, where she participated in potato sack races and shared news of her new haircut with fellow parishioners. The next day, Monday, July 18th, 1994, Tanya attended summer classes at Meany Middle School in the morning. She was last seen leaving the school around 11 a.m., as expected. Afterward, she was supposed to take the bus to her part-time job at a thrift store on Jackson Street run by the Chicken Soup Brigade, a local nonprofit. When she didn't return home by 6 p.m., her mother, Teresa, went to the thrift store to check on her. There, she discovered that Tanya had never arrived for her scheduled shift. Teresa then went to Meany Middle School to look for Tanya, but there was no sign of her there. Teresa contacted the police to report Tanya missing around 7:30 p.m. Police did not seem to view Tanya's disappearance as an urgent matter. They repeatedly tried to get her younger sister to say that Tanya had plans to run away from home and referred to Tanya as a runaway throughout their initial report. This was an important distinction because while a missing child would have a detective assigned to their case, a runaway would only be assigned a community service officer. An officer spoke to two of Tanya's friends and called Teresa a few days later to ask if she had heard from Tanya. Tanya's mother did not believe her daughter had run away, both because it would have been out of character for her and because of practical considerations. If Tanya had left on her own accord, she had done so without any of her belongings or any money. At the time she disappeared, Tanya was excitedly waiting for her first paycheck from her part-time job, which she was due to receive in just a few days. She planned to use the money to buy pagers for herself and for her 12-year-old sister, Tina. Tina herself was another reason why no one who knew Tanya believed she had run away. Tina and Tanya were very close and were described as soulmates. Tanya would almost certainly never have gone anywhere without Tina and would have at least talked to her if she had any plans to leave. Tina spent the night after Tanya disappeared with her bedroom window open just in case Tanya came home. While she could not imagine Tanya running away, the idea of something bad happening to Tanya was even more difficult to fathom. Tanya's church quickly came together to organize on Tanya's behalf when she disappeared. Corporate policies prevented them from posting flyers in many stores, but they still covered the area in over 1,500 missing persons posters. The police have a hell of a task. I want to be supportive of that, Father Ralph Carskadden, Tanya's pastor, told the media. But I also feel that had Tanya not come from our neighborhood or not been mixed race, would more people have known this terrible thing had happened to her? On July 23, 1994, 5 days after Tanya went missing, a 62-year-old man was walking his dog along East Highland Drive when he noticed the smell of death. He had become familiar with that smell during his time serving during the Korean War. He stepped into a wooded area along the street and saw someone lying at the base of a tree at the bottom of a ravine. He stared at the person for several seconds before he fully processed the fact that he was looking at a human body. The body belonged to Tanya Fraser, who had been stabbed to death. The medical examiner believed she had not been killed until July 20th, 2 days after her disappearance. This caused fear in Tanya's mother, Teresa, that the police initially dismissing her daughter as a runaway may have resulted in her death. From the first report, I often wondered if they took it as more serious. If they looked in that first 24 hours, would there have been a chance she maybe would have been saved? That's a big question, she later told the Seattle Times. Tanya's community came together to mourn her loss. A memorial was established near where her body was found, and members of her church took to the streets for walks of remembrance. It was a member of her church who donated the cemetery plot where Tanya would be buried. Tanya had a routine of picking out one of her stuffed animals to take with her on her walk to school every day. Other students now took up this habit. Tanya was last seen alive at 21st Avenue and East Thomas Street, approximately 11 blocks away from where her body would later be found. Her friends reported seeing her speaking to an unfamiliar, unkempt man. This man has so far never been identified. Despite the best efforts of her loved ones, Tanya's case received little media attention. Talking about her daughter's murder was unbearable for Teresa, but she tried to find any opportunity to do so that she could in order to keep the case in the news and hopefully reach a witness who could help solve the case. Flyers posted by Crime Stoppers generated just 3 calls to the tip line, none of which helped advance the investigation. Private investigator Rose Winquist began working with Tanya's family the week she went missing. She continues to work on the case and forwards every credible lead she finds to the police. Seattle Police Detective Ralph Norton, who has been the lead investigator on Tanya's case since June of 2016, says that there are numerous persons of interest in the case, none of whom will be cleared until the case is definitively solved. Despite the fact that almost 30 years have passed since Tanya's murder, her sister, Tiara, is still hoping that one day the case will be solved. I am hopeful. I can't imagine this just never being solved and never having that closure, so I'm hopeful that it will be, she said in 2023. Natalie McNally grew up as one of 4 children and her parents' only daughter. Her parents and 3 brothers treated her like a princess, but this did not cause her to become soft and spoiled. She was fiercely independent and fought for herself and for others. She had type 1 diabetes from a young age, but always fought through the health challenges the condition caused for her. She campaigned for women's political issues and fought for animal rights. She had a bright and loving personality that earned her many friends, for whom she would have done anything. Natalie had a career in marketing and worked for the public transportation company TransLink. She lived in the Silverwood Green area of Lonergan, County Armagh, Northern Ireland. In December of 2022, 32-year-old Natalie was pregnant with her first child and looking forward to becoming a mother. She would be the first of her siblings to have a child, making her baby her parents' first grandchild. Natalie planned to use the name Zara for a girl and Dean for a boy. She had an ultrasound scheduled for December 20th, where she would learn her baby's sex. While her immediate family knew she was pregnant, she planned to announce her pregnancy, as well as her baby's sex and name, to her extended family on Christmas Day. Natalie went to see her parents, Noel and Bernadette, on Sunday, December 18th. Around 10 p.m. the following day, December 19th, emergency services were called to her home. Natalie's body was discovered inside. She had been stabbed numerous times, with some of her injuries being defensive wounds. It was determined that Natalie had been murdered on the evening of December 18th, sometime after arriving home from visiting her parents. She had been due to have the ultrasound where she would learn if she was having a boy or a girl 2 days after she was killed. During her post-mortem examination, it was discovered that she had been expecting son. A vigil for Natalie was held on her street on December 23rd. Friends and family members addressed the crowd before pink and blue balloons were released in Natalie's memory. Natalie's funeral was held at her parents' home on December 26th, with hundreds of mourners gathering outside the house before traveling to St. Coleman Cemetery, where Natalie was to be buried. Music was played over a loudspeaker during the service, which ended with the song Humans by The Killers, Natalie's favorite band. A 32-year-old man was arrested on the day Natalie's body was found, but he was subsequently released and cleared as a suspect. Another 32-year-old man was arrested on December 21st, but he was also later released, and no charges had been filed in the case. More than 3,000 hours of CCTV footage from the area around Natalie's home has been collected as a part of the investigation. Authorities believe that some of this footage captured Natalie's killer coming and going from her home. They have released images of the man they think is the killer, carrying a rucksack and wearing shoes with white soles in hopes that a member of the public can identify him. He is seen in the footage arriving on Natalie Street at 8:52 p.m. on December 18th and leaving at 9:30 p.m. Police are asking for anyone with footage taken in the area on the night of the murder to submit it to them for analysis. They are also still looking for witnesses and have reminded the public that Natalie was killed on December 18th, the same day as the World Cup final, in hopes that it will help potential witnesses recall the correct evening. Investigators have stated that they believe Natalie knew her killer. There were no signs of forced entry into Natalie's home, and authorities believe she willingly let her killer inside. Whether the killer had come to Natalie's home with the intention of killing her or decided to kill her after arriving remains unclear. At a press conference on January 5, 2023, Detective Chief Inspector Neil McGuinness stated that he believed the murder weapon had been recovered and that it had come from within Natalie's home instead of being brought to the residence by the killer. On January 6th, police conducted a search of the grounds of the Silverwood Golf Club, which is located next to Natalie's home. The search was reportedly a general part of the investigation and was not conducted based on a particular tip. The search focused mainly on the pathways and shrubbery within the club's grounds. Police also made house-to-house inquiries in Lisburn on 6th. As part of the investigation, they seized a vehicle from the area for further examination. Police activity refocused on Natalie's neighborhood on 8th, with detectives returning to the scene of the crime and officers passing out flyers and speaking to motorists and pedestrians in Lonergan looking for witnesses. Natalie's family is devastated by her loss and by the fact that they will never meet her baby. It's just unimaginable. I can't see a future. There will be no joy in life now because she's gone, Natalie's mother, Bernadette, has said. The family remains in regular contact with the police and continues to speak to the media so as to appeal to the public for information. They have also publicly thanked the community for supporting them, saying that the messages they have received are helping them get through this ordeal. Crime Stoppers is currently offering a reward of up to £20,000 for information that leads to the arrest and conviction of Natalie's killer. Natalie's brother, Declan, has appealed to the public. We just can't reiterate enough that if anyone has any information whatsoever, even if it seems insignificant, bring it to the police or bring it to Crime Stoppers. We need justice because that's all we have left now is to try and find out who did this to Natalie. Before we continue, 90% of you haven't subscribed to our channel, so if you like this video, please subscribe. It motivates us to make more content for you. Okay, let's continue. Imagine a little girl found alone in the harsh Arizona desert. Her identity a mystery and her fate a chilling question mark. For years, her story has haunted the annals of unsolved mysteries, leaving investigators puzzled and a community in deep sorrow. Today, however, we find ourselves at a pivotal moment of discovery and heartbreak, as this cold case has thawed just enough to reveal a glimmer of truth. We will explore the perplexing saga of Little Miss Nobody, delving into the severity of her abduction, the eerie circumstances of her murder, and the recent revelation that has sent shockwaves through the realm of crime solving. Join us as we navigate this intricate web, a 62-year-old cold case where casual curiosity intersects with the sobering reality of a mystery that refuses to fade. On July 31, 1960, in Sandwash Creek, Arizona, a cool breeze swept through as residents began their day. A schoolteacher from Las Vegas had come to Sandwash Creek in search of rocks for his class when he noticed something unusual in the distance. It stood out starkly against the natural surroundings. It was black and charred. As he approached, he uncovered a grim truth that would spark a 6-decade-long mystery. Upon getting closer, the teacher spotted a small mound of dirt. After gently brushing it away, he discovered a crudely and shallowly buried body. It was small, and he quickly realized it belonged to a child. The remains were severely decomposed due to the Arizona heat and the conditions in which she had been disposed of. Moments later, the heartbroken teacher directed the Yavapai County Sheriff's Office toward the grim discovery. The county medical examiner's office was not far behind them, and the crime scene investigation began. Officers discovered the remains had been placed in a shallow grave, and the person responsible for dumping and burying the remains had then set them ablaze, perhaps to hide the evidence or make the identification more difficult. 2 sets of footprints were found near the makeshift shallow grave, with one of them distinctly belonging to a male adult. Disturbingly, 2 other mounds of disturbed and charred soil were found, indicating her killer had tried to burn and dispose of the remains twice before settling on a final spot, a detail that remains perplexing to this day. The remains were transported to the Yavapai County Sheriff's Office, where the heartbreaking autopsy would take place. Medical examiner determined that the remains likely belonged to a Caucasian female, aged 2 to 7 years old, although this was later refined to 3 to 6 years old. The girl had brown or auburn hair, was 3'5", and was 50 to around 55 pounds. All of her baby teeth were present and in pristine condition, and there were no signs of trauma to her bones. Given that the remains had been burned and left in the Arizona heat for at least 1 to 2 weeks before being discovered, the remains were too decomposed to draw a full conclusion on how the girl had died or exactly when. There were no fractures, yield or new, and due to the nature of her discovery, the case was marked as a homicide. Medical examiner investigators next turned their attention to the clothes that the girl had been found wearing. According to the Doe Network, she was wearing a sunsuit with white or pink shorts, a contrasting blouse with a chain design, and a pair of men's adult flip-flops purposely cut down to her size and affixed to her feet with brown leather straps. Her fingernails and toenails had also been painted red. By all accounts, it appeared that the young girl had been physically well looked after. So how had she come to be dumped in a shallow grave next to a creek? Investigators broadcasted information about the girl's discovery across local media outlets, but few viable leads emerged. The discovery of such a young girl dumped in such a callous way deeply affected the community. The community of Prescott came together to raise money for her funeral and headstone. Midway through 1960, the little girl was buried in Mountain View Cemetery in Prescott, Arizona. The headstone that read "Little Miss Nobody" and "Blessed are the pure in heart." Around 70 people from the local community gathered to remember Little Miss Nobody, a name she would carry for 62 years. Meanwhile, investigators had another clue they had held back from the public. At the scene, they had discovered tire tracks. The first proved that the killer had driven onto the creek from the direction of Highway 93 before parking and finding a spot to dump the young girl. After disposing of her, they jumped back into their vehicle, pulling partway into the desert sand and taking a left, turning and driving away from the site. Unfortunately, it doesn't appear as though investigators were able to determine the make or model of the car from its tire tracks. The footprints had also become a key area of importance for investigators. One pair had been made by an adult, with the other being made by a child in flip-flops, an eerie coincidence to the details of the case. Investigators speculated that the girl was forced to walk to her burial site with the attacker before being buried. Close to the crime scene, the Yavapai County Sheriff's Office found a rusted blood-stained knife. The knife was sent to the FBI for further testing, but it's unclear whether this was ever conclusively linked to the case. In 1960, DNA testing was not available, so the FBI would only have been able to obtain the blood type from the knife. Whilst this may seem insignificant, it may have helped investigators narrow down their pool of possible victims based on this parameter. Shortly after the details of Little Miss Nobody's case went public, an anonymous witness came forward with a fascinating story. In the days before Little Miss Nobody had been found, he had witnessed a family walking through the desert. The group consisted of a man, a woman, 2 boys, 2 girls, and a baby. The witness was able to describe the clothes of one of the girls, which fit the description of Little Miss Nobody's body. The day the witness saw this group was the day before Little Miss Nobody's body had been found. Another witness came forward to have claimed to have seen the same family, but this time there was only 1 girl, 2 boys, a baby, and the 2 adults. The witnesses both believed that the family had been transient based on their appearance and commented that they were wearing overalls and cloth caps. Investigators honed in on the transient family and were able to find a family fitting their description in the area. However, despite extensive questioning, nothing ever came of this lead. And like all the others, it eventually fizzled into nothing. There were several possible candidates of missing children that could have possibly been Little Miss Nobody, one of which was 4-year-old Sharon Lee Gagos from Alamogordo, New Mexico. The possibility that Sharon Lee Gagos was Little Miss Nobody was greatly overlooked when the medical examiner determined that the body had likely belonged to a 7-year-old girl, making her much older than Sharon. In the years that have passed, this number was revised several times based on new analysis. The clothing found on Little Miss Nobody also didn't match the clothes that Sharon had last been wearing when she'd been abducted. Add to this that Sharon had disappeared over 500 miles from Sandwash Creek, and investigators felt hope slipping through their fingers. The final nail in the coffin for this lead were the results of the FBI footprint analysis that were carried out in August 1960. Footprints from Little Miss Nobody and Sharon were compared and were found to not be the same. After this, investigators were forced to drop this lead and consider other missing girls. Some investigators never let go of this thought, though, and it lingered in their minds for decades to come. After Sharon was ruled out, the case's leads also dried up, and the case eventually fell cold. Occasional tips and leads would be called in, but none of them ever led to the identity of Little Miss Nobody. And in a devastating blow to the case, the storage area that housed the evidence for the case, which included the knife, the clothing, and other pieces of items collected from the scene, were damaged in a water leak that had gone unnoticed for some time. All of the evidence collected for the case had to be disposed of, and who knows what critical evidence had been lost. The case fell silent until 2015 when the NCMEC, the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children, paid to have the remains exhumed. By this time, the case had garnered attention in online sleuth circles, many of whom had a good idea of who the body belonged to. Little Miss Nobody was exhumed in 2015, and a DNA sample was extracted from the remains. According to Othram Labs, this sample was able to give them a mitochondrial DNA profile which was passed down through their maternal lineage. This DNA sample was uploaded to Cody's, and initially no matches were found. Whilst this was a small setback, investigators felt confident that this new DNA evidence would be the key to unlocking the case. In 2018, The National Center for Missing and Exploited Children also worked with forensic specialists to create the first ever facial approximation sketch of Little Miss Nobody. After decades of being faceless, the public now had a possibility of what she may have looked like. This new reconstruction was circulated in the media, and soon after, the calls started to roll in. Many believe that the girl in the reconstruction bore a striking resemblance to the abducted child, Sharon Lee Gagos. Although Sharon had been initially ruled out in August 1960, the UPI investigators knew better than to discount the unlikely. The county sheriff's office contacted Othram in 2021 and requested their assistance. Othram used Little Miss Nobody's remains to obtain another DNA profile despite what they called a substantial degradation and extreme non-human DNA burden. With this new sample, Othram hoped to perform a KinSnap rapid familial testing, which is a DNA test that confirms relationships between siblings. Genealogists have been working hard behind the scenes using the information obtained by Othram and the public and were able to track down possible siblings of Little Miss Nobody. Thanks to the KinSnap testing, it was only a matter of weeks until the truth could finally be discovered. In March 2022, Othram and the Yavapai County Sheriff's Office held a joint press conference in which they announced that Little Miss Nobody was the missing 4-year-old Sharon Lee Gagos of Alamogordo, New Mexico. On July 21, 1960, just 10 days before her body had been found, Sharon was abducted from the backyard of her grandmother's home. At the time, Sharon was outside playing with her cousins when a man and a woman in a dark green sedan, a 1951 or 1952 Plymouth or Dodge, pulled up to the curb. According to her cousins, a freckle-faced young boy was also in the car, along with another child. The woman first wound down her window, called out to Sharon, asking her to come with them under the promise of sweets and new clothes. Sensing danger, Sharon said no, which only angered the woman. Within seconds, she flew out of the passenger seat, grabbed Sharon by the elbow, and threw her into the car. The vehicle then sped off into the distance before anyone in the Gagos family were able to react. Sharon was swiftly reported missing, and investigators immediately began their search for her. Roadblocks had been set up within minutes of her abduction, and to this day, it remains unclear how Sharon had been spirited out of Alamogordo. Her cousins described the man behind the wheel as white and thin with a long nose and sandy hair. The woman was described as white, short, in her 30s with dirty blonde hair. In the days before Sharon disappeared, her family had noticed a few bizarre goings-on. At a church service, a woman had been asking about Sharon and her mother, Guadalupe. Days later, the same woman arrived at a neighbor's house asking probing questions about Sharon and her mother. The woman was keen to know all about Sharon, whether Guadalupe had any other children, and who else lived in their home. There are also reports that Sharon had become timid and withdrawn in the days before her abduction and had mentioned a dark green car following her. Investigators believe that Sharon's kidnappers had planned the attack and had been following her for some time before they struck. But to this day, their identities remain a mystery, as does the identity of the freckle-faced boy who was also in the vehicle. Is he also a John Doe waiting to be uncovered deep in the Arizona desert? While one door in this case is closed, another remains open, and investigators are determined to uncover who did this to Sharon. Why had these people taken her and spent so much time stalking her to only then kill her 10 days later? There had always been a hope that Sharon had been out there somewhere, maybe had been abducted, to have been raised by another family. Sharon's brother, Roberto Juan Gagos, had been the one to provide the all-important kinship DNA test, which confirmed the remains belonged to his lost sister. He now resides in Germany. Their parents have since passed, but there remain living aunts, uncles, and many cousins. Those who were still around made a statement to the press expressing their gratitude to bringing Sharon home. How and why she ended up 500 miles away, dressed in different clothes, remain a mystery to both them and the investigators. Her family is also trying to come to terms with the fact that those who took Sharon may have been close to the family or their community. Also made aware of the identification was the last surviving detective who had worked the original case. Now 91 years old, he had been relieved there had been identification on the case. On October 25, 2022, Sharon's body was interred at the St. Francis Delaware Paula Catholic Church in Tella Rosa, New Mexico, with the remains of her mother and grandmother who had never given up looking for her. The Little Miss Nobody headstone has been removed, and instead, Sharon now has a headstone that bears her name, something she has deserved for over 6 decades. Sharon's abduction and murder case remain open and active. Anyone with information of the case of Sharon Lee Gagos is asked to contact the Yavapai County Sheriff's Office at 92877-13260. As we draw the curtains on the heart-wrenching story of Little Miss Nobody, now known as Sharon Lee Gagos, we find ourselves at a crossroad of revolution and lingering questions. Sharon's journey from a nameless victim to a beloved daughter, sister, and cousin, whose memory is finally adorned with dignity of her own name, is nothing short of astonishing. The discovery of Sharon's identity brought with it a flood of emotions: relief for her family, validation for the tireless investigators, and renewed sense of hope for justice. But it also left us with a profound sense of sadness as we grapple with the lingering mystery that shroud her abduction and murder. The details of Sharon's tragic story, from our heart-wrenching abduction to the puzzling circumstances surrounding her discovery, have captivated our hearts and minds. Tyler's efforts, investigators, genealogists, and forensic experts have finally pieced together. Why were Sharon's abductors so meticulous in their planning? What drove them to carry out such a heinous act? Who was a freckle-faced boy who was in the dark green sedan with her captors? These questions, like ghostly echoes from the past, remain unanswered. Sharon Lee Gagos has found her resting place alongside her mother and grandmother, a poignant reunion after 6 decades of separation. These questions, like ghostly echoes from the past, remain unanswered. So, what do you think of this mystery? January 9th, 2009, began like any other day for Robert and Janice Choy. Around 5 a.m., they were getting ready to leave for work. The couple owned Penn Station Beauty Supply, a thriving beauty supply store situated in Suburban Station, a key train station in central Philadelphia. Their successful business enabled them to purchase a 4-bedroom home in North Wales, Montgomery County, located north of Philadelphia. Each day, they drove into the city to manage their store. They did not get to leave, as was their routine on this day, however. Janice was in their garage, putting on her shoes, and Robert was in their driveway, on his way to warm up his vehicle, when they were ambushed by 3 armed men. The attackers dragged Robert into the garage as he asked why they were doing this and tried to fight them off. The 3 men then began beating him and binding him with duct tape and flex ties. Janice was then forced inside the home by 2 of the unknown men. She was taken upstairs, where the attackers forced her to help them get into the safe in her bedroom. They stole between $15,000 and $20,000 in cash, some gold jewelry, a passbook for a Korean bank account, and a family symbol stamp. The Chase's 2 adult children also lived in the house but had been asleep when the attack started. 23-year-old Mina awoke to the sound of her mother hyperventilating in the hallway and got up to check on her. One of the attackers put a gun to her head and demanded access to the safe, as her mother had not yet provided it. When Mina said she did not know how to open the safe, she was taken to the garage and forced to kneel on the floor next to her severely injured father. 29-year-old Richard was awoken by the attackers coming into his bedroom and shining flashlights in his face. They pistol whipped him, and he fell to the floor before being dragged from the room. Janice, Mina, and Richard were all taken to the basement and bound with duct tape. One of the attackers stayed in the basement to guard them, but he then went upstairs. As soon as she and her children were alone, Janice was able to free herself enough from the duct tape to run out of the house through a door in the basement. She ran to a neighbor's house to call 911. When the attackers realized that Janice escaped and had most likely gone for help, they immediately fled. Richard was able to free himself and his sister and ran upstairs to lock the door to prevent the men from coming back inside the home. Richard and Mina then went to their father in the garage. Duct tape had been used to bind his feet together and his arms behind his back. Robert's head was also almost completely covered with duct tape. By the time police arrived on the scene, Robert was dead. He was 58 years old. His autopsy found that he had died as the result of asphyxia. The duct tape covering his head restricted his airway, and due to the severe beating he was subjected to, He bled extensively, and his blood went into his airway. Robert was born Jimchiki in a small village in Korea in 1950. He grew up very poor and was able to leave his village by joining the military. When he first came to the United States, he had only a few $100 with him and no English language skills. Despite these circumstances, he got married, had a family, and started his successful business. When he became a naturalized U.S. citizen, he changed his first name to the more American-sounding Robert. There had been a string of home invasion robberies targeting Asian business owners in Philadelphia, so the possibility that Robert's murder had been connected to these crimes was considered. However, the victim profile appeared to be the only thing in common between the attack on the Choy family and the other robberies. In those crimes, the victim was accosted by armed perpetrators who quickly took money and valuables and left. None of these other robbery victims or their families were restrained or assaulted. Furthermore, the perpetrators in these crimes wore ski masks to prevent their victims from being able to identify them. The fact that the individuals who attacked the Choy family and killed Robert had not worn masks raised concerns that they had not been worried about the Choys being able to later identify them. They may not have worn masks because they planned to kill all the members of the family to eliminate any witnesses, a plan that was ruined by Janice Choy's escape. Richard J. had poor eyesight and relied on glasses to see clearly. Since he obviously did not sleep with him on, he could not clearly see the individuals who pulled him from his bed and forced him into the basement. Mina and Janice J., however, were able to provide detailed descriptions of two of the men who had invaded their home. They worked with a sketch artist to develop composite images of the men, which were then released to the local media. Because Janice and Mina could potentially identify the men who attacked them and killed Robert, police feared that the men may return to kill them to prevent them from ever making such an identification. The Choys did not feel safe in their home because they shared such fears and found it difficult to be in the place where they had been attacked and Robert had been murdered. They therefore went to stay with family, and police kept them under surveillance there for their safety. While only 3 men had forced their way into the Choy home, more people may have been involved. According to the surviving members of the Choy family, the 3 attackers inside the home had been talking on cell phones. The conversations the Choys overheard indicated that the people on the other end of the line were also involved in the crime. Cell phone data would prove to be critical to the investigation. Police obtained a subpoena which allowed them to access the records of the cell phone tower located closest to the Choy home in order to see what calls were being made in the area at the time of the home invasion. They were able to identify at least 3 phones that had been in contact with each other in the area at the time in question. Unfortunately, they were all prepaid cell phones, meaning there was no account owner on record for any of them. However, investigators were able to identify other numbers each of these phones had been calling. In analyzing these records, they came across calls made to someone close to the case, Angelo Shin. Shin was the nephew of Robert Choy. While he was in high school, Shin had lived with the Choys for a year and a half while his parents had been in Korea, meaning he was familiar with the layout of the Choy house and aware of the location of their safe. Robert and Janice treated Shin as though he were their own son, and their son Richard considered Shin to be a brother. Shin had a minor criminal record, 1 drug arrest, and would later be labeled by prosecutors as a wannabe gangster. Police were surprised that a member of the Choy's own family could have been involved in the attack on them that resulted in Robert's death. The possibility was also concerning because it meant the surviving members of the family were potentially in serious danger. They had been staying with Shin and his family since the murder, meaning he had easy access to them should he and his accomplices decide to kill them to prevent them from identifying the men who had invaded their home and killed Robert. Therefore, once Shin was identified as a potential suspect, police quickly tried to get the Choy family away from him. When they contacted Mina and Richard Choy to ask if they knew where their cousin was, they were with him. Investigators asked them to come with their cousin to the police station so that they could all be asked some more routine questions. When the 3 of them arrived there, Shin was placed in one room and Mina and Richard in another. While Shin was questioned by police, Richard and Mina were informed that their cousin may have been involved in the attack that had resulted in their father's murder. The news was devastating. At this time, police did not have enough evidence to charge Shin with murder or any charges related to the robbery, but they were afraid for the Choy's safety should he be released. In his statement to police, Shin had claimed that he had never been in contact with anyone involved in the crime. Using the cell phone records that showed him communicating with the cell phones used in the area at the time of the murder, they were able to arrest him on a charge of providing false information to police and hold him. After just a day in jail, Gene changed his story and admitted to his involvement in the home invasion. He told police that he had been bragging about his rich uncle to his friend Joseph Page, a 23-year-old from Philadelphia. Shin told Page that his uncle kept over $100,000 in the safe in his home. Page had a history of committing home invasion robberies and decided that Shin's uncle sounded like an ideal target. He recruited 5 more people to execute the robbery, 2 who would enter the house with him and 3 who would later be referred to as the cleanup crew who acted as lookouts and getaway drivers. Shin worked with Page for over a month to orchestrate the robbery. He also attended a meeting to plan the home invasion where he provided everyone involved with information about his aunt and uncle's daily routine and the location of their safe. He claims to police that his family was supposed to be left unharmed. It is unclear how he could honestly have been so confident in his relative's safety, given the fact that he saw the duct tape, knives, and guns the others had collected to use during the crime at this meeting. Shin told police that he had learned of his uncle's murder when Page called him, upset about the much smaller amount of money in the safe than he had been promised. Page allegedly told Shin that Robert had died because they needed to hurt him a little after he tried to resist during the attack. Because so many people had been involved in the crime, each perpetrator received a relatively small amount of money for their participation. Angelo Shin betrayed his family and got his uncle killed for just $2,000 on February 4, 2009. Shin and the other 6 alleged participants in the home invasion were charged with the crime. Shin was charged with third-degree murder, and the others, 5 of whom had been present at the scene, were all charged with both second- and third-degree murder. Page, 25-year-old Amitati Latham, and 18-year-old Carrie Pitts were identified as the 3 men who entered the house. Julius Wise, 32, Robert Eatman, 33, and Sybil White, 17, all of Philadelphia, were all charged as members of the so-called cleanup crew. Unfortunately, what this investigation has revealed is far more sinister than a simple robbery. Angelo Shin is a traitor of the worst kind. He is a traitor to his family, he's a traitor to his people, and his treachery is of the lowest kind we've ever seen here, Montgomery County District Attorney Risa Vetri-Furman stated when the charges were publicly announced. Page and Latham were tied to the crime by the cell phone data. After they were arrested, they were obligated to provide samples of their DNA, which also tied them both to the scene. Page's DNA was found on the inside of a portion of a finger from a black latex glove, consistent with the type the Chays said their attackers wore, found near Robert's body, and Latham's DNA was found on some of the duct tape used to restrain the Chays. Investigators believe it got there when he used his teeth to rip the tape. White, who had been the getaway driver, pleaded guilty to third-degree murder. At her sentencing hearing, she took full responsibility for her participation in the crime, but also said she had been convinced to participate because she was foolish, stupid, naive, and gullible. She was sentenced to 4 to 8 years in prison, plus 20 years of probation. Eaton also pled guilty to third-degree murder and apologized in court. He received 20 to 40 years in prison, plus 4.5 to 9 years for a robbery charge. Wise, who had participated in the planning of the home invasion and helped cover it up after the fact, pled guilty to third-degree murder the day after his trial for second-degree murder began. He was sentenced to 16 to 32 years in prison. Eatman and White were both witnesses for the prosecution when Page, Pitts, and Latham went to trial. Page and Latham were both found guilty of second-degree murder, robbery, burglary, and conspiracy. Page was given a consecutive 40 to 80-year prison term over and above a life sentence. Latham was sentenced to life plus 32 to 64 years. Pitts, alleged to have been the third man to actually enter the Che home, was found not guilty at trial as there was no cell phone or DNA evidence tying him to the crime, and Mina and Janice Che had not gotten a good enough look at him to be able to identify him. Angelo Shin pleaded guilty to third-degree murder. In October of 2010, he was sentenced to 20 to 40 years in prison for his role in the robbery that cost his uncle his remorse he expressed. Robert's death, the trauma of the home invasion, and Angelo Shin's betrayal left the surviving members of the Che family unable to live a normal life. Robert's son Richard has stated that he could not comprehend how someone could betray their family in such a manner. Susan Preece lived in an old vicarage on a traveler's site in Pontefract, West Yorkshire, with her 6 siblings and their mother. Struggling to raise her children alone, their mother often had to place them in foster care temporarily. In 1969, a family of travelers from Scotland befriended 4-year-old Susan while staying on the site. The parents told Susan's mother, Maureen, that they were taking their 2 sons to Disney World for 2 weeks and offered to take Susan along with them. Wanting her daughter to experience the trip, Maureen felt she could not provide for her in the way the travelers could. Maureen agreed to let Susan go with them. At the time, a child Susan's age did not require a passport to travel from the UK to the United States, just their birth certificate and a parent's signature, which Maureen provided the couple. However, 2 weeks passed and the couple did not return Susan as they said they would. Maureen would spend the rest of her life searching for Susan. She regularly visited various traveler sites looking for the family who had taken her daughter and frequently made trips back to the site where she had previously lived long after she moved away. She passed away in 2014 without ever seeing Susan again. The couple had not taken Susan to Florida as they had told Maureen they would be. Instead, they took her to Canada, then Australia and New Zealand. Susan grew up being told that she was adopted after her biological family had disowned her. She enjoyed her life within the traveling community and later said that the couple she was told had adopted her spoiled her rotten. Susan did not learn the truth about how she came to live with her traveler family until she was 16. The family traveled from Australia to New Zealand, and Susan did not need a passport upon entering New Zealand. However, she did need one to return to Australia. She went to apply for one, but the application required the signature of a parent. When she went to the man, she called her father to get his signature. He tearfully admitted why he could not sign it. Susan's birth family had never disowned her, and he and his wife had never adopted her. They had stolen her from her family instead. The couple had 2 sons, and Susan later theorized that they had taken her because they wanted a daughter. Susan was shocked but did not fully comprehend what her situation meant. She stayed in New Zealand until she could apply for a passport as an adult. She returned to Australia when she was 19 and went on to marry a traveler, becoming Susan Gervasi. She had 3 children and eventually 4 grand. She and her husband ran a charity for travelers. It was not until 2022 when she had a conversation with someone who had been adopted that Susan processed how serious her abduction was. The woman asked her if she was curious about how her birth family was. The woman asked her if she was curious about how her birth family was feeling about her being gone, and Susan experienced what she later described as a light bulb moment, realizing that her birth family may have actually cared for her and wanted to know where she was. Susan remembered where she had lived back in England, so her husband posted about her story in a Facebook group for the area. Within half an hour, her family had been found. Their efforts to find her had always been hampered by the fact that they did not know the surname she had been given by the couple who took her, or later her married surname. When Susan was able to speak to her siblings on the phone, they were crying hysterically with joy at the news that she was alive and located. While her disappearance was solved and Susan was reunited with her family, neither of Susan's abductors could face any charges as the woman who had multiple sclerosis passed away when Susan was still a child and the man passed away when Susan was 21. In the fall of 2022, more than 50 years after she was taken from her family, Susan traveled back to England to be reunited with her siblings and celebrate her 57th birthday. While she was not reunited with them until after their mother passed away, the reunion came just in time for one of her sisters who has Parkinson's disease and dementia. She was able to see Susan before her condition worsened to the point where she could not understand what was happening. Susan hopes her story will give strength to the loved ones of other missing people. It gives a message to anybody who has lost somebody that miracles do happen. There is hope. That miracles do happen. There is hope, she said after her reunion with her family. One day in the summer of 1992, Bob Kopta returned to his home in Ross Township, Pennsylvania. But his wife of 20 years, 52-year-old Patricia, was not there as he had expected. It was not uncommon for her to leave home for short periods of time without telling anyone, but he ultimately reported her missing. In school, Patricia had been a straight-A student who worked as a model and a dance instructor. After graduating from high school, she continued dancing by attending weekly ballroom dancing events and took a job working in finance at a plate glass company in Pittsburgh. She met Bob Kopta near a river in Pittsburgh, and he offered to give her and the friends she was with a ride on his boat. Bob and Patricia fell in love and married in 1972. By the time she disappeared in 1992, Patricia's life had become far less idyllic than it once had been. She had resigned from her long-time job at the glass factory because she suffered from migraines, which her doctors told her were the result of stress. She then went to work as an elevator operator at the Art Institute of Pittsburgh. While she was employed there, her family began noticing concerning changes in her behavior. It was at the Art Institute where she claimed to have started receiving visions, saying she had seen an angel while she was there. Patricia then soon became a well-known street preacher in the area, dubbed the Sparrow because of her small build. She frequented parking lots and busy streets in Ross Township, as well as concert venues and stadiums in Pittsburgh, preaching to people as they walked or drove by. She preached about her religious visions and tried to warn people about the end of the world, which she believed to be imminent. Patricia was briefly institutionalized prior to her disappearance. Doctors at the facility diagnosed her as having delusions of grandeur and stated she was showing signs of schizophrenia. Patricia was afraid of being placed in an institution long-term, so when she went missing, police theorized that she had voluntarily disappeared to prevent this from happening. Patricia's family and the police tried every avenue of investigation open to them. They even went so far as to consult a psychic to try to find Patricia. However, they could not find any trace of her. After Patricia had been missing for 7 years, she was declared legally dead. More than 30 years later, Patricia's shocked surviving family members were present at a press conference on March 3, 2023, during which Ross Township Police Department Chief Brian Colehep announced that Patricia's disappearance had been solved. She had been found alive living in a nursing home in Puerto Rico. Patricia being in Puerto Rico made some level of sense to her family. She had previously vacationed there multiple times with friends before she got married and had talked about wanting to travel there again because she enjoyed the climate. Bob Kopta had even taken out newspaper advertisements about his wife's disappearance there in hopes that someone on the island had seen her, but he never received any information from the effort. While Patricia's location was logical enough to her family, they were still shocked to learn that she was still alive after 3 decades. Patricia's twin sister died without knowing what happened to Patricia, but Patricia's husband Bob and younger sister Gloria finally learned her surprising fate. Patricia had been in Puerto Rico since at least 1999, around the time she was declared legally dead back in Pennsylvania. She had been wandering around several towns in the northern part of the island. She was found living on the streets and identified as a person in need. This allowed her to be placed in a care home for adults. At the time, she would not reveal any details about her past or her identity. At one point, she hinted that a cruise ship from Europe had brought her to Puerto Rico. Patricia developed dementia years later, which led to her, perhaps inadvertently, revealing more details about her origins to her caregivers in passing. They were eventually able to piece together enough of the random pieces of information to find Patricia's case back in Pennsylvania. They contacted authorities there, and DNA samples provided by Patricia's sister and nephew confirmed that the woman in Puerto Rico, who now required more intensive care in a nursing home, was Patricia Kopta. Since Patricia was located, Bob Kopta has stated that he is relieved that his wife was not murdered or otherwise harmed. He is also happy that she is being taken care of so well in the nursing home. In the decades since Patricia disappeared, he would always fear that his wife had been killed and her body had been found any time he heard about police finding human remains on the news. He never remarried even after Patricia was declared legally dead. However, he has no plans to visit Patricia in Puerto Rico. Patricia's sister Gloria does plan to travel to Puerto Rico to see her, even though she understands that Patricia will most likely have forgotten her due to her dementia. Whether she knows me or not, I still want to see her and give her a hug and tell her I love her. I thought maybe she had died, Gloria said at the press conference. 28-year-old Judith Bellow lived on Saratoga Drive in Stanwood, Washington with her husband and 3-year-old son. She was employed at the National Food Corporation in Savannah. It was at work where she was last seen on December 13, 1993. She left the facility at 9:30 that morning and was not seen again. She did not pick up her son from daycare and did not return to her home. Her car was later found abandoned at the post office in Stanwood. Police investigating her disappearance did not believe that she had left voluntarily because she would not leave her son behind and she was very close with her siblings. They believed that she had most likely been the victim of foul play. Their investigation did not locate Judith or her body, and her case eventually went cold. Years later, Judith was featured as the Eight of Hearts in a deck of playing cards issued by the Snohomish County Sheriff's Department. Each card in the deck featured an individual who was the subject of an ongoing cold case investigation, including missing people and murder victims. The decks of cards were distributed throughout the community in hopes that someone with information about one of the cases would see them and call in a tip. A tip did later come in finally solving the case. However, it did not come from a witness, it came from Judith Bellow herself. On November 23, 2011, a woman claiming to be Judith called the Snohomish County Sheriff's Department and left a message stating that she was alive and living in California. In the following weeks, the Sheriff's Department investigated this claim and ultimately determined that the woman who contacted them was in fact Judith Bellow. According to Judith, she had voluntarily disappeared because of serious problems in her marriage. She had cut off contact with her family because she was afraid of her husband and feared her siblings would face harassment from him if they knew where she was. She left Washington State in August of 1994 and was living in California when she saw her case on the Sheriff's Department's website. Since she left Washington, she had given birth to 3 more sons. Judith was not the only relative her family had spent years looking for. 3 months after Judith disappeared, her husband had abruptly left town with his and Judith's son, cutting off contact with Judith's family. They did not hear from Judith's son until he was a teenager and chose to reach out to his mother's family on his own accord, contacting his maternal grandmother in Mexico shortly before she died. Judith's siblings were ecstatic to find her and to learn that they had 3 more nephews. Several of her brothers began making plans to go to California to spend Christmas with Judith and her sons once the Sheriff's Department put them in contact with her. By 2009, 81-year-old Robert Merl Herod was ready to embrace a slower pace of life. Having recently lost his beloved wife, Georgia, after 50 wonderful years of marriage, he was also preparing for his own eventuality. While Robert drove a modest 1997 gold Toyota Camry, his finances were anything but ordinary. Some articles speculated his net worth to be around $5 million, thanks to savvy investments and valuable assets. True to his modest lifestyle, Robert chose to live at 522 Carnation Drive in Placentia, California, in a 3-bedroom, 3-bath home that was ideal for raising a family. However, by 2009, all of Robert's children were adults with families of their own. Although his life had been marked by sorrow, brighter days lay ahead. Back in 1950, Robert had met and become engaged to a woman named Frontel Heater. The two were deeply in love, but unfortunately, they did not get their fairy tale ending. Shortly after their engagement, Robert joined the military, and they went their separate ways. Robert ended up marrying Georgia, and Frontel also married someone else. However, even after 60 years, the two couldn't stop thinking about each other. After the pair's spouses had passed, and thanks to the internet and modern technology, Robert was able to connect with his long-lost love, and the spark between the two was undeniable. Facing the fact that neither of them was getting any younger, they threw caution to the wind and married on June 29, 2009, only 6 days after they met in person for the first time in decades. Frontel lived in Missouri at the time of their union, and she had arranged to move in with her new husband. In July, Robert and his children began doing up the house and preparing for Frontel's arrival. Robert glowed to his housekeeper about his wife's arrival, and nothing seemed amiss in his life. On the morning of July 27, 2009, Robert's son-in-law arrived at 522 Carnation Drive to help Robert with the house. After a cup of coffee and a little chat, game planning the tasks ahead, Robert's son-in-law left for Home Depot to grab supplies between 11 a.m. and 12 p.m. For a few hours, the son-in-law milled around Home Depot, grabbing the necessary supplies and tools for the jobs at hand. At around 1 p.m., or some sources report closer to 2:30 p.m., the son-in-law returned to Carnation Drive only to find it empty and locked. Robert's housekeeper was also sitting in her car out front, waiting to be let inside. She explained that Robert usually left a hidden key if he was going to go out, but this time there was no key present. The front door was locked, and Robert wasn't responding. Luckily, the son-in-law had a key and was able to get the pair in. The housekeeper finished her duties, noting that Robert's bed seemed to be in a state of disarray, something she hadn't seen before. Robert's time in the military had drilled in the necessity for a made bed. Even at 80, it was something he did daily. Nevertheless, she cleaned and left the home that evening. Robert's son-in-law desperately tried to find Robert in the home, fearing that he'd had an accident or a fall, but the house was silent. Robert wasn't responding to his calls, and that is when he rang his wife, Robert's daughter. Eventually, the rest of the family was filled in on the situation, and the Placentia police arrived at Carnation Drive by nightfall. Bizarrely, Robert had apparently left with his wallet and keys, but hadn't taken his beloved gold Toyota Camry or his glasses. His children also mentioned that Robert had bad knees and wasn't able to walk long distances. He also couldn't see a few feet in front of him without his glasses, so it seemed unlikely that he'd just walk out of the house. There are some reports that on the night before Robert disappeared, there was a heated argument between him and his daughter over her mother's estate and about what she was set to receive, although this can't be verified. Robert had planned to put Fontel's name on some of his assets that made up his $5 million estate. When law enforcement learned this information, their ears immediately perked up. Through further digging, they discovered that the transfer of assets had yet to occur, and Robert had disappeared before he had the chance. A week after their father's disappearance on August 7, 2009, 2 of his children filed for conservatorship, which would allow them to seize control of their father's assets. They would later tell law enforcement that they wanted the control to maintain his home, pay his bills, and gather reward money. According to reports, Fintel was staunchly against the conservatorship, contesting the application in court, and she continued her plan to move into 522 Carnation Drive. After she moved in, she changed the locks on the house. A protracted legal battle ensued between Fintel and Robert's children. By 2014, the courts declared Robert deceased and passed control of his estate over to his children. Fontel was subsequently evicted from the home and is now said to be living in Kansas. A bulk of the attention was focused on Robert's money. But where was Robert? And in another bizarre twist, Robert's barber was named as a possible suspect by the Placentia Police Department. His barber, who was a woman several years his junior, had once been Robert's girlfriend or in some sort of romantic relationship. Apparently, throughout their relationship, Robert had lent her over $86,000. The Placentia police naturally looked at her and her husband as suspects, although they claimed that the money had been repaid before Robert's disappearance. The only other suspects in Robert's case are his son-in-law and housekeeper. With differing reports on how long his son-in-law was gone, it's possible he may have had time to attack Robert and dump his body somewhere remote. CCTV footage and receipts prove he did go to Home Depot that day, but it doesn't appear that anyone was able to vouch for what time he returned to 522 Carnation Drive. The Placentia police did look into the son-in-law and barber, although neither of them nor anyone in Robert's family has been officially named as a suspect. In 2019, the case was revitalized 10 years after Robert's disappearance, when it was announced that 2 people had been arrested in connection with Robert's disappearance and now presumed murder. The pair were eventually released without being charged, and their identities were never made public. Many believe that the barber and her husband were the ones held by police, but no entity has ever confirmed this. The only other conclusion left in Robert's case is that Robert was attacked in his home by a stranger, although this seems unlikely. There have never been any reports that anything valuable was taken from the home. There was no blood or sign of struggle in the home other than the unmade bed. Moreover, the neighbors did not report hearing a disturbance, and despite his age, Robert was not a frail man. The other conclusion is that Robert wandered off. His family did tell investigators that they believed he was in the early stages of dementia or Alzheimer's. He had begun forgetting things like phone numbers and addresses, although this could be chalked up to old age. Did Robert wander off? Was he attacked by a stranger who bizarrely had no interest in his valuables? Was he attacked by someone he trusted, perhaps even loved? Robert Merl Herod is described as a white male with gray hair, blue eyes, 5'11", and 140 pounds to 170 pounds. Robert is bald on top with short, thin hair around the sides. He usually wears glasses, but these were left behind. He was last seen wearing white shorts, a white V-neck undershirt, white knee socks, a white belt, a white hat, white Reebok sneakers, a plain gold wedding band, and possibly a Masonic ring with a red stone. Anyone with information is asked to contact the Placentia Police Department. September 21, 1982 started like any other for loggers working on land near Highway 25 near Richland, Barron County, Wisconsin. Part of the adjacent land was private property, but that afternoon, one of the loggers crossed the threshold and risked trespassing. While assessing the situation, trying to ascertain what property he was on, around 100 yards from the tree line, the logger spotted a small mound of clothing. The clothing struck him as odd. As the area was private land and mostly deserted, it wasn't near any roads or junctions, and it gave him an uneasy feeling. The logger got the attention of co-workers, and the group approached the clothing together. As they drew nearer to the clothes, their hearts sank. It wasn't just a pile of clothing. A skeleton lay inside them, and with the skull being several feet away. The men ran back to their vans and called the Barron County Sheriff's Department, who in turn called the medical examiner to the scene. Once the remains were located and photographed, they were sent to the medical examiner's office, who, in conjunction with local forensic anthropologists, started their investigation. The bones were categorized and counted, and the investigation could begin. It didn't take long for the medical examiner and the anthropologist to determine that the remains belonged to what they believed was a white male, aged 18 to 24, with brown hair, 5'7" to 5'9", and 180 to 195 pounds. His remains were entirely skeletal, and it's estimated that he'd been out and exposed to the elements since May or April of that year, possibly earlier. Disturbingly, the man had met a violent end, with the medical examiner finding 3 puncture wounds to the chest, so deep that they left marks on the thoracic vertebra. Investigators couldn't discern whether the man had met his end in the woods or whether he'd been dumped there after the fact. With few pieces of evidence to work with, investigators turned to their next clue, the clothing. The man was found wearing blue Sears brand jeans in a size 38 waist, a long-sleeve cotton Western-style plaid shirt with pearl buttons, a denim jacket, Maverick brand white underwear, white athletic socks with a blue trim, and size 10 blue tennis shoes with white stripes. Investigators found corresponding cut marks on the man's shirt and jacket to where he had been stabbed. The man didn't have a wallet with him, and it doesn't appear that the clothes held any names or labels or clues to his identity, but investigators were not done with his bones. In fact, they had a story of their own to tell. According to the Doe Network, the Barron County John Doe, as he'd come to be known, had a surgically repaired left knee with a screw and staple in his tibia. The screws and staples had serial numbers on them, but the manufacturer couldn't trace them to a specific hospital. The Doe Network also noted something very interesting. In their reports, they wrote the procedure would have required a sophisticated hospital, an extended hospitalization, and a long recovery period 6 months to a year. This points to the young man coming from a comfortable middle class, perhaps very affluent family, as they would have been able to provide him with the money for the procedure and recovery. Despite all of this information and extensive searches in dental records, hospital records, no one came forward to claim him, leading him to be dubbed the Barron County John Doe. With so much medical information in this case, investigators found it hard to believe that it would go unsolved for so long, but it did for 38 years. In 2019, a new breath of life was given to the case when the Barron County Sheriff's Office contacted the DNA Doe Project, a non-profit organization specializing in unidentified human remains. By December 2019, the DNA Doe Project had uncovered their victim's identity. Shortly after, The Barron County Sheriff's Office collected DNA from the victim's family to confirm the match. In early 2020, the Barron County Sheriff's Office was finally ready to announce that the 1982 Barron County John Doe was Craig Patrick King. He would have been 20 or 21 years old at the time of his death. Craig was born in 1961 in White Bear Lake, Minnesota, and graduated White Bear Lake High School in 1979. According to Craig's parents, they last saw him in White Bear Lake sometime in 1981. Craig had a documented history of mental illness, and the last time they had seen him, he'd been carrying several $1,000 of cash with him. White Bear Lake is around 82 miles from Barron County, and it's unclear how he ended up there as he didn't own a car. He was remembered as a well-liked young adult. In school, he'd played hockey and golf. He was an avid athlete and he had been reported missing, and it's unclear why he had been reported missing, and it's unclear why his missing persons case wasn't connected to the body discovered in 1982. Though his family is relieved to have him home finally, but the manner of Craig's death has caused them a lot of pain. They're now appealing to the public for anyone with information to come forward. Please contact the Barron County Sheriff's Office. In 1972, Sherry Lee Dean married for the first time at 17 years old, but their marriage only lasted until February of 1974. According to the Charlie Project, Sherry married her second husband, whose last name was Taylor, 3 months after the divorce from her first husband had been finalized, around May or June of 1974. Sherry and her second husband lived in Fort Worth, Texas, and by 1976, the pair had a 1-year-old child. This is where Sherry's case takes a strange turn due to a lack of evidence. According to her second husband, Sherry was last seen on July 15, 1976. Her husband reported her missing soon after, telling the Fort Worth Police Department that Sherry had walked out on him and their child, but couldn't provide a reason why. Interestingly, it appears that the husband had filed for divorce exactly 1 year after he reported her missing. By July 1977, the divorce was finalized, but Sherry was still nowhere to be found. One web sleuth user has suggested that Sherry might be Nipton Jane Doe 778 Ufka. The Nipton Jane Doe was found in May of 1976, although it's possible that Sherry disappeared long before her husband reported her missing. When looking at mortuary photographs of the Nipton Jane Doe, a resemblance to Sherry can be seen. The Nipton Jane Doe does fit the general description, but had no signs of prior pregnancies or birth, something that Sherry would have likely displayed. While the similarities between the Nipton Jane Doe and Sherry may seem a lot, it's important to remember that these details are guidelines, and many details have been found to be wrong in the past. The Nipton Jane Doe was found in Nipton, California, 1,200 miles from Fort Worth, Texas. Again, it's not outside the realm of possibility that someone traveled a fair distance to ensure the woman couldn't be identified. We can only speculate and spread awareness in cases like Sherry's, where there's little information and no one to advocate for them. Sherry Bethel, also known as Sherry Dean, her maiden name, or Sherry Taylor, is described as a white female with brown hair and brown eyes, 5'6" and 130 pounds. She was 21 years old at the time of her disappearance. Her husband's full name has never been revealed to the public, and law enforcement hasn't revealed much information about the case. Anyone with information is asked to contact Eric Martinez at the Fort Worth Police Department. Rita Curran loved to sing and shared her love of music with her family. She was a beloved second-grade teacher at Milton Elementary School in Milton, Vermont when she was off from her full-time job for summer breaks. Rita also worked part-time as a maid at the South Burlington Colonial Motor Inn. 24-year-old Rita remained living at home with her parents and siblings even after she began working full-time. That changed in the summer of 1971, however, when Rita saw a room that was for rent for the summer in an apartment on Brooks Avenue in Burlington, Vermont. After deciding she was a good fit with the potential roommates, Rita decided to move in for the summer. She shared one room with a young woman named Beverly, and a couple, Carrie and Paul, lived in the apartment's other bedroom. On July 19, 1971, Rita had only been living in the apartment for 2 weeks. That night, her roommates Carrie and Paul went out to dinner and then went to a bar called the Harbor Hideaway. Around 11:15, they called their apartment to see if their roommates wanted to join them for a drink. Beverly answered the phone and told them she would meet them there. She did not invite Rita because she was already asleep. Beverly left the apartment at 11:20 p.m. Paul and Carrie returned home at 12:30 a.m. on July 20th, and Beverly arrived shortly thereafter. When Beverly entered her bedroom, she discovered Rita's body and called out to her roommates for help. Rita had been viciously attacked. Her autopsy found that she had been severely beaten, raped, and then strangled to death. She had fought fiercely against her killer. She appeared to have been asleep at the time the attack began, as she had curlers in her hair and was surrounded by scraps of her clothing, including her nightgown. All of her clothes had been ripped from her body during the attack. Based on her roommate's movements, it was determined that the window of time during which the murder occurred was just 70 minutes. Police collected evidence, followed up on leads, and interviewed neighbors. No arrests were made. Authorities later actively investigated the possibility that serial killer Ted Bundy was Rita's murderer. He had been actively killing at the time of her murder, and the motel where Rita worked was next to the Elizabeth Lund home for unwed mothers where Bundy had been born. Rita's sister Mary even wrote to Bundy asking him if he had been involved in Rita's murder. No evidence was ever found tying Bundy to the crime, and 45 minutes prior to his execution in 1989, when asked if he had ever killed anyone in Vermont, Bundy said no. Decades would pass, but police interest in solving the case did not diminish. In 2014, authorities in Vermont went out of state for help in processing evidence from the scene. The New York City office of the chief medical examiner processed evidence looking for DNA. While the slides made from vaginal swabs taken during Rita's autopsy were too degraded to identify DNA, they were able to sequence a male DNA profile from a cigarette, but that had been found next to Rita's body. It would later be determined that this profile was a match to DNA also found on Rita's nightgown. However, there was not a match to the profile in any criminal database. Rita's case was reopened in 2019, and instead of having one investigator working on the case, as was protocol for cold cases, an entire team was assigned to investigate her murder. Genetic genealogy was used to identify relatives of the man whose DNA was found at the crime scene. In combing through their family trees, investigators came across the name of someone who had been interviewed about the case back in 1971. This man had since died, but he had a half-brother living in Alabama who agreed to provide a sample of his DNA. This sample confirmed that this man's half-brother was the contributor of the DNA that was found at the crime scene. On February 21, 2023, Burlington police announced that they had identified the suspect in Mita's case as William DeRuiz. DeRuiz and his wife had lived in the same building as Rita, 2 floors above her apartment. Shortly after Rita's murder, DeRuiz had moved to Thailand to become a Buddhist monk. He and his wife divorced after not seeing each other for some time. DeRuiz eventually moved back to the United States and remarried. He died of a drug overdose in San Francisco in 1986. An informant had identified DeRuiz as a potential suspect early on in the investigation. However, when police interviewed his wife, Michelle, she said that her husband had been with her at the time of the murder. When she was re-interviewed 50 years later, Michelle admitted that DeRuiz had not been with her. He had argued with her that night and then gone out for a walk to cool off. Because they lived in Rita's building, police had notified Draus and his wife of the murder the morning after it occurred. According to Michelle, as soon as he closed the door, her husband had turned to her and told her to say she had been with him all night if police asked her any questions. Therefore, when she was formally interviewed by police, Michelle provided her husband an alibi. Police do not believe Michelle knew her husband killed Rita. They view her dishonesty as the result of her being coerced by her husband rather than as her being a willing accomplice in covering up his crime. Giroux did have a history of manipulating women and went on to commit acts of domestic violence and violence against women. He once strangled his second wife until she became unconscious, and on another occasion, he stabbed one of her friends, seemingly at random. Rita's parents passed away before DeRuiz was identified, but her brother and sister did get to learn who took their beloved sister from them. While DeRuiz cannot be prosecuted for the murder, investigators say they are unanimously certain that he killed Rita and the case is now closed. Sarah Mobley Hall experienced loss early in life, but it only made her more dedicated to helping others. She was raised by her grandmother because her mother died shortly after the birth of Sarah's sister, Mary. According to Mary, Sarah treated her as though she were her own child and always had faith in her. Sarah was very outgoing and well-liked by those who knew her. In 1984, 27-year-old Sarah was a single mother living in the Hidden Valley neighborhood of Charlotte, North Carolina. She worked with children with special needs like her son, 10-year-old Derek Mobley. Derek had a jovial personality and was very close with his mother. On March 14, 1984, police were called to Sarah and Derek's apartment, which was in a complex on Ventura Way. They had been called because the door to the apartment was open and a foul odor was coming from inside the home. When police entered the apartment, they discovered the bodies of both Sarah and Derek. They had both been strangled, and Sarah had also been badly beaten. Sarah's sister, Mary, worked near Sarah's apartment and spent a lot of time at the home with her sister and nephew. "I carried a burden for years because I felt like I should have been with her," Mary later said. "It would have never happened if I was with her." Decades would pass before an arrest was made in the case. Finally, on February 1, 2023, 60-year-old James Thomas Pratt was arrested without incident in York County, South Carolina. He was extradited back to North Carolina to be charged with Sarah and Derek's murders. While he does have a criminal record, he's only ever been charged with minor misdemeanors. He lived in the same neighborhood as Sarah and Derek at the time they were killed and is believed to have had a friendly relationship with them. It was DNA that finally led to Pratt's arrest. The Charlotte-Mecklenburg Police Department received a grant from the Bureau of Justice Administration, which allowed them to use new technology in the investigation. DNA was found on the pillow Sarah's body had been found resting on, but there was no match to the profile in criminal databases. Investigators then attempted to use forensic genetic genealogy in the case, looking in commercial DNA databases for relatives of the contributor of the DNA found at the crime scene. This effort did not identify a potential suspect. They then partnered with state police to use familial DNA technology. Instead of using commercial DNA sites, this technique involved searching the state criminal DNA database looking for people who were related to the individual whose DNA was found on the pillow. This effort is what ultimately led to Pratt being identified as a potential suspect. Police then worked with the FBI to obtain a sample of Pratt's DNA, which proved to be a match to the DNA from the crime scene. According to the Charlotte-Mecklenburg Police Department, this is the first time familial DNA has been used to solve a murder in the state of North Carolina. The technology was previously used in the state to make an arrest in a previously unsolved rape case and to identify a John Doe in 2022. Pratt is currently being held at the Mecklenburg County Jail. After Pratt's arrest, Sarah's sister Mary said, "I'm so grateful the police have found this person, and I hope he spends the rest of his days behind bars." Wilhelmina Filkins, who went by Violet, came from a large family, growing up with 7 sisters and a brother. She never married or had children of her own, and in 1994, she was 81 years old and living alone in a ground-floor apartment in East Greenbush, New York. She retired after a long career with the State Department of Education but remained active. Despite her age and the fact that she did have a car, she made almost daily walks to a local convenience store, where the employees were fond of her to buy grocery items. She loved to garden and volunteered often. She was a quiet woman who lived a simple life, attending Mass regularly and always keeping her weekly hair appointment. She was close with her family and friends, and her neighbors all liked her. Violet was last seen alive on Wednesday, August 17, 1994. 2 days later, on August 19th, her brother Sterling and her niece Carol went to her apartment to check on her. They realized that something was amiss before they even reached the apartment. They noticed that the curtains were caught in the apartment's sliding glass door, which meant the door could not be locked as Violet normally kept it. When they opened the door, they discovered Violet's body lying close to it. Violet had been beaten severely about the head. From 1989, Plymouth Reliant was located at the apartment complex but was not found in the manor Violet usually parked at. Police believe that Violet was killed during a daytime robbery and that her killer had used her vehicle to transport items stolen from her home before returning it to her apartment complex. Her killer did not appear to profit very much from the robbery and murder, as it is believed he disposed of many of the stolen items right after killing Violet. The items were found abandoned behind a local cemetery 3 years after Violet was killed. An arrest was not immediately made despite the best efforts of investigators. In the following years, the case was investigated by numerous law enforcement agencies, including the State Police Troop G Major Crimes Unit, the Bureau of Criminal Investigations Unit at the State Police Barracks, and the East Greenbush Police Department. However, it would be more than 28 years before the case was finally closed. On January 19, 2023, police announced that they had identified the man they believed killed Violet. His name was Jeremiah Guyette, and he had been 18 years old at the time of the murder. He had been living in the same apartment complex as Violet when she was killed in a unit he shared with his father just around the corner from where Violet lived. He had been interviewed about the case in 1994 when police canvassed the neighborhood but was not considered a suspect at the time. He went on to serve in the Air Force and live in Florida before returning to upstate New York, where he worked as a bus driver, transporting both children and the elderly. Unfortunately, Guyette could not be prosecuted for Violet's murder. Investigators had identified him as a potential suspect in 2019. They went to see him on October 1st that year. When they told him they wanted to speak with him about an incident that had taken place 25 years earlier, he immediately became visibly upset. He told the investigators that he would not speak to them without an attorney present, and they left. The next day, police came to the home after receiving a report of a shot being fired there. Guyette had shot himself in the head. He did not survive. A relative later told police that Guyette had called them after investigators came to see him and stated that he did not want to go to prison. Guyette had been brought to investigators' attention by one of his ex-girlfriends. In 2009, he made statements to her while crying like, "That poor old woman, I robbed her, I hit her, and I just left her there." She did not think anything of these statements until 2019 when she was watching programming about cold cases on Netflix. She did some research and found out that an old woman, Violet, had been robbed and killed while Guyette was living near her. She then went to the authorities with this information. Guyette's DNA and fingerprints were taken during his autopsy, but due to a backlog of cases at the lab and the pandemic, it was years before they were analyzed. When the evidence was finally examined, Guyette's left thumbprint was matched to a print taken from Violet's coffee table. According to police, at the time of the murder, Guyette had plans to steal a car and rob a bank in order to pay for college. Violet's family is grateful to finally have the answers they feared they might never receive. In 2015, Marty and Glenna Durham, both 46, lived in Sand Lake, Michigan. The couple had been married for 10 years, each having previously been married and having grown children. Marty was known for being security conscious, wary of strangers, and diligent about locking the doors to his home. However, he was also a good friend and neighbor to the few people in his social circle. Keith and Connie Ream, who lived across the street, communicated with the Durhams daily via calls and texts. Concern grew when they suddenly stopped seeing or hearing from the couple, despite multiple messages and 2 visits to their home. On May 13, 2015, after 2 days without contact, Connie decided to check on Marty and Glenna again around 4:30 p.m. As soon as she attempted to enter the home, she sensed something was wrong. The door was unlocked, which was unusual for Marty. The house, typically well kept, was now in disarray, with various items scattered about and a lamp broken. In a bedroom, she discovered Marty and Glenna lying on the floor, both covered in blood. She ran outside to get help from firefighters who had been attending to a fire down the street. First responders initially believed that both Marty and Glenna were dead. However, an hour after authorities arrived on the scene, a trooper from the Michigan State Police was trying to lure the couple's upset dog out of the bedroom. He noticed that Glenna appeared to still be breathing. When he went to check her pulse, her eyes opened, and she cried out, "What are you doing?" Despite a serious injury from a gunshot wound to the head, Glenna was still alive, and she was taken to the hospital. Marty was not as lucky. By the time he was found, he was dead, having been shot 5 times. 3 shots fired at close range had entered his chest. He had also been shot once in the back and once in the forearm. He was survived by both of his parents, 3 children, and 4 grandchildren. Marty had been an avid outdoorsman, and he had found ways to continue enjoying some of his favorite outdoor activities, even after he required the use of a leg brace. The leg brace was used to help treat lingering injuries from a serious car accident Marty had been involved in back in 1995 when his car was struck by a truck speeding through a red light. The accident left him in a coma for weeks and with extensive injuries. The entire left side of his body had been severely injured and his brain had been jolted against his skull with enough force to cause permanent damage to his frontal lobe. He required months of intensive medical care and rehabilitation. While he was able to eventually lead somewhat of a normal life, he did have ongoing medical problems as a result of the accident. In 2010, Marty's condition worsened, and he required more daily care as a result of the ongoing effects of his injuries. Glenna began receiving $3,153 a month from the state of Michigan to serve as his caregiver. Marty also received $1,100 a month in disability payments. Marty was notoriously frugal. He did not like to pay to have his home heated, so visitors had to wear thermals under their clothes when they came to see him in the winter. As anxious as he was about spending money, he did find ways to make sure he could still enjoy some of his favorite, but more expensive outdoor activities. By cutting his expenses like his utility payments, he was able to carefully save up money each month for big purchases so that he could still hunt and fish. However, while he was concerned with his finances, it was Glenna who actually handled them. Glenna was not as careful with money as her husband. Glenna had a love of gambling, and while Marty was aware of her hobby, Glenna appears to have kept the extent of her gambling problem a secret from him. Marty would normally accompany Glenna on her trips to casinos, which she would make once or twice a week, but Glenna would also ask family members not to tell her husband about some of her gambling activity or the amounts she spent. In 2010 alone, she spent $75,000 gambling at casinos. In addition to her casino trips, Glenna would also visit gas stations near her home 3 to 4 times a week to purchase lottery tickets, spending between $50 and $100 during each visit. Glenna was in charge of actually paying all of the couple's bills and told Marty that they were current on all of them. They were not. In the years leading up to Marty's death, the couple had started going into debt. They owed money on one of their cars and to the IRS. When a collection agency attempted to repossess the vehicle, necessary payments on it, she had not. In April of 2015, Marty's mother Lillian saw a legal notice in a local newspaper stating that her son and daughter-in-law's home was being foreclosed on. She called Marty to ask about the foreclosure, but he knew nothing about it. When he bought a copy of the paper and showed the notice to Glenna, she told him that it was a misprint and that she would call the newspaper office. She assured him that it was a mistake and that the mortgage was still being automatically withdrawn from their account every month. The $700 monthly mortgage payment had in fact not been paid in a year, and the checking account it was supposed to be withdrawn from only had $182 in it. Their savings account only had $118 on April 28, 2015. Foreclosure documents were delivered to the home. The house was set to go up for public auction on May 13th, the day Marty was found dead. After the murder, the documents were found torn up in one of Glenna's drawers. Glenna appears to have kept the true state of the couple's finances and the imminent loss of their home from her husband. Marty seemingly had no idea that his house really was in foreclosure as he continued to make improvements to the home up until 2 days before his death when he painted his bathroom ceiling. Marty's 2 sons and daughter went to his home the day after he was found dead. There, they found a manila envelope that had not been processed by the police. Inside were letters Glenna had written to her children and her ex-husband. In the letters, she asked her husband to look after their grown children. She apologized to her children and told them that she loved them. Marty's children were concerned by the implications of these letters. They believed that their stepmother wrote the notes prior to attempting to take her own life. Other evidence surfaced supporting the theory that Glenna had killed her husband and then turned the gun on herself. Between 3:32 and 4:48 a.m. on May 12th, Glenna's cell phone had been used to research Ruger firearms, specifically the Ruger .6, the type of weapon used to kill Marty and critically injure Glenna. After these searches, Glenna's phone then sent a text message reading "Love you, sorry" to Glenna's mother. Blood evidence also showed that Glenna had moved around the house after she had been shot. Most importantly, her blood was found on a couch in the living room. The Ruger .6 revolver that was used in the shooting had been found hidden under the love seat in the living room. The neurosurgeon who treated Glenna would later testify that it would have been possible for her to move around the home after being shot with her specific injury. Due to her extensive injuries and the months of physical rehabilitation she required, Glenna was not thoroughly interviewed by the authorities until October of 2015, 5 months after Marty's murder. During this interview, Glenna claimed to have no memory of anything that happened between May 11th and when she was taken to the hospital. She was adamant, however, that she had not killed her husband. She claimed that she only went online using her phone to play games and that she did not perform any of the searches about Ruger firearms. She said that the letters to her children sounded like letters she had previously written to them on their birthdays, but also said that she would have only written acrimonious things to her ex-husband, which was in conflict with what she actually wrote in her letter to him found in the envelope at her home. While the financial troubles Glenna and Marty were having, as well as the fact that Glenna had hidden them from Marty seemingly up until just before his death gave Glenna a motive to kill her husband, and physical evidence seemed to support her involvement in his death, Glenna was not arrested. As the months went on with no charges filed in the case, Marty's family became more and more aggravated. They were vocal in the local media about their frustration with the lack of movement in the case. In addition to a dog, Glenna and Marty also had another pet, an African gray parrot named Bud. Marty had owned Bud with his first wife, Christina Keller. Christina had another parrot, and since she had previously owned Bud and knew how to properly care for parrots, Bud went to live with her after Marty's death. Bud, like many African gray parrots, had a talent for mimicking voices he heard as well as an impressive memory. Several people the police spoke to during the course of their investigation asked them if they planned to interview Bud. After Bud went to live with Christina, she became concerned by some of the things she heard him saying. Bud would regularly repeat the same profanity-laden argument, which appeared to have taken place between two people. He used two different voices to represent the two participants in the conversation, switching between them as he went through each part of the argument. According to Christina, one of these voices sounded like Marty. The apparent argument would end with Bud speaking in his voice for Marty, yelling at someone not to shoot. Christina was concerned that Bud had witnessed Marty's murder and was relaying the argument he overheard just prior to Marty being shot. Because of all the concerns about Glenna's involvement in the case, Christina suspected that the person Bud heard Marty arguing with was Glenna. She recorded a video of Bud going through the exchange a month after Marty's murder, but did not immediately share the video. After the first anniversary of Marty's murder came and went with no arrests made in the case, Christina did decide to release the video to a local news station. The station aired their story on the case in early June, and the video quickly garnered national attention. 3 weeks after the story featuring the video of Bud aired, Glenna was arrested and charged with Marty's murder. Authorities denied that the video of Bud played any role in Glenna's arrest. Instead, they maintained that they had to wait more than a year to make the arrest because they had been waiting on the results of some tests that required a lot of time and the completion of some interviews that could not be made immediately after Marty's death. Glenna had finally been arrested because the investigation finally had enough evidence to support the murder charge against her, not because of the video. Some of this testing showed that Glenna's DNA was present on the murder weapon, which would prove to be a major piece of evidence at her trial. Christina Keller, however, believed that Bud deserved some credit for helping get justice for her ex-husband. Bud helped us get attention from Marty's murder, and I believe it put pressure on the prosecutor to make the arrest with all the media pressure, she told the Cedar Springs Post. While prosecutors were aware of Bud and his apparent recounting of the events leading up to Marty's murder, they believed they had enough evidence and a strong enough case to prosecute Glenna without him. While Bud's apparent play-by-play of the argument that led up to the murder was certainly evocative, there would have been extensive legal challenges to trying to use Bud in court. prosecutors were able to show that Glenna had a strong motive in no longer being able to hide the imminent loss of their home from Marty, and strong evidence in the DNA found on the murder weapon, Glenna's phone activity, the notes, and the evidence at the scene that supported their assertion that Glenna had killed Marty following an argument before turning the gun on herself in an unsuccessful attempt to take her own life. The jury agreed with the prosecution. On July 19, 2017, after 8 hours of deliberation, they found Glenna Durham guilty of first-degree murder. She was sentenced to life in prison with no chance of parole. Glenna maintains her innocence and still has supporters who speak out against her conviction. In April of 2019, Glenna appealed to the Michigan Court of Appeals, arguing that the evidence found on her phone that showed she had been researching the type of weapon used in the shooting was hearsay and therefore inadmissible and unfairly prejudicial. The appeal was rejected. On December 23rd the same year, the Michigan Supreme Court denied her request to appeal that decision. Glenna is currently serving her sentence at the Women's Huron Valley Correctional Facility. On January 13, 1996, in Arlington, Texas, Amber Hagerman was riding her new pink and white bicycle that she'd just gotten for Christmas. In the parking lot of an abandoned Winn-Dixie grocery store, the 9-year-old Girl Scout was with her 5-year-old little brother, Ricky. They were playing down the road from their grandmother's house, when apparently Ricky remembered they were only supposed to go around the block and headed back home. Amber stayed and continued to play around the parking lot. It was a Saturday, and they were at their grandparents' that day because their mother was being interviewed for a local news special about families that successfully got off welfare and rejoined the workforce. Amber and Ricky left their grandparents' home around 3:10 p.m., with Ricky returning shortly after without his sister. Families soon went looking for Amber, and when they arrived at the parking lot, they saw a handful of police officers surrounding Amber's bike. They were told that someone in the community saw something and that Amber had been abducted. A witness and retired police officer, Jim Cavell, 78 at the time, said he saw Amber riding alone when he saw a black pickup truck and, quote, he pulled up, jumped out and grabbed her. When she screamed, I figured the police ought to know about it, so I called them. Jim gave a description of the abductor. He said that it was a man, Caucasian or Hispanic, in his 20s or 30s, shorter than 6 feet, medium build, with dark hair. He was driving a black pickup truck with no markings or chrome and seemed to be in clean working condition. He noted the time of the deduction was 3:18 p.m., and Amber had only been alone for a few minutes. Law enforcement, the FBI, and locals began a massive search for Amber, and her abduction made national news, but despite the nationwide attention, no other witnesses ever came forward to identify the man or the vehicle. For days later, a man was walking his dog when he saw something in a creek. When he looked closer, he found a body lying face down in the water. Police arrived at the scene, and the body was identified as the missing 9-year-old Amber Hagerman. Amber's body was found less than 4 miles from where she was abducted. She was found completely naked except for a sock on her left foot, and her throat had been cut. Police believe that she was washed down the creek as there had been considerable rainfall the night before she was discovered. Police worked hard to find anything on Amber's murder, but there was little evidence. It was later discovered that she had been alive for at least 2 days after her abduction, making police believe that someone might have seen something. Also, due to the circumstances of the abduction, they believe that Amber was targeted and may have been stalked prior to her being taken. Since Amber's death, law enforcement has followed over 7,000 possible leads. There was a laundromat next to the abandoned grocery store where Amber was abducted. Authorities know that this area had many Hispanic people who may have felt uncomfortable talking to police at the time. Police have said in more recent press releases that they do not care about legal status and they just want any information on Amber, and that it might be given anonymously, and urge anyone with information to come forward. They want justice for her family. In a 2021 press conference, it was released after all this time that they did have one piece of evidence with DNA. Police have stated that they would not reveal the evidence as only the killer would know. They had planned to test the evidence through more modern means later that year. Donna Williams, Amber's mother, said, quote, to Amber's killer, I'm asking you today, please turn yourself in. Give Amber justice. Amber needs justice deeply. It has been over 25 years since Amber was murdered. Police have never stopped looking for her killer, and she has had a significant impact not only on Arlington, but across the country. Amber's case was what inspired the Amber Alert system, which was suggested by a local woman, Diane Simone. She wanted to help in search efforts, but didn't know how to best assist. She had an idea to utilize radio station and news broadcasting to amplify missing or abducted children cases, using the existing systems that were used to alert to weather warnings or civil defense alerts. It has been called several names in honor of other missing children in other states, but is now called the Amber Alert system nationally and even internationally, with other countries adopting the system. In the US, the Amber Alert has saved over 1,114 children. Thank you for joining us on this journey into the depths of unsolved mysteries. Cold cases not only challenge our understanding of the past, but also ignite our curiosity and determination for answers. Remember to subscribe to stay updated on our latest investigations. And if you have any information regarding the cases we've covered, don't hesitate to reach out. Together, we can shed light on the shadows of the past and bring closure to those who seek it. Until next time, stay vigilant, stay curious, and never stop seeking the truth.